Okay, so let's start the creation of our central controls by creating our hip control and our master control. Once we have those created, I am going to go ahead and parent in certain parts of the rig that we created back in Character Rigging 1. For those of you who joined us in Character Rigging 1, I'm going to parent in certain parts of that rig to our various controls that we're about to set up. So let's begin by creating our hip control. I'm going to create a new null, and I'm going to create that around where our hips are. So I'm going to create a new null, which I'll name to hip control. Let's give this a blue node color since we're dealing with a control object. I'm going to set up the color convention of having yellow controls in the center of the character, so all of these controls are going to be yellow. So I'm going to set the wireframe color to yellow. I want a control type of circles, an orientation of the ZX plane, and let's boost up our geometry scale. Probably need to even boost that further. Some of around 13 looks like it's going to work nicely. Now let me bring up the visibility of my goblin geometry for a second, so we can see the goblin geometry. I will switch over to a shaded view. I'm going to translate this down in Y very slightly to around where our hips are, so right around, probably around here will work, around about a negative 4.25 or so. So we're going to have our hip control there. Now I'm not going to worry about cleaning its transforms just yet because of the fact that we are going to be parenting this into the master control in a second. I will, however, lock the scales, pivot, and uniform scale since this control is designed solely for translation and rotation of the hips. Whilst we're here, we can go ahead and get our hips from the rig that we created for our legs. Both of the R underscore and L underscore hips, whilst keeping position, parent them into the hip control. That means if we grab our hip control and start moving the hip control, we're going to be affecting our legs. Fantastic. So we got that in place. Let's go ahead now and create our master control. So I'm going to come down here to the very bottom of the network, create a new null, which I'm going to name to master control. Again, a blue node color, and again a yellow wireframe color. I do, in this case, want to set this to be a custom control type, and we're going to create a custom control down at the SOP level. So custom control type, let's jump down inside. Going to jump into a top view with space 2, turn on our construction plane, and I'm going to start out by dropping in a circle SOP, and I want to create a NURBS circle, which is going to be an open arc, so we don't actually get a surface created. I do want the ZX plane, and I do want to boost our radius up to around about, let's go further than that, a little bit further, around about 8.5 or so. So that's going to be this circle, and inside this circle I want to have an arrow shape curve indicating that you can move this control around. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the visibility of all the other objects. I also want to make sure I'm creating in context so that when I create a curve, it gets created down inside our master control null. Now I do want to reference our circle, so I'm going to turn on the templating for our circle. I'm also going to turn on grid snap with the X key, and let's create a curve that looks something like so. So I'm just drawing out a very simple arrow shape curve, trying to keep the proportions symmetrical. So we need to come down, and indeed I need to actually offset this. I'm going to create this, but it needs to be offset slightly in the Z direction, as you can most likely tell already, but I'll create it as is and then I'll offset it later. So I need to come down 5 and a long 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, back to there, and actually it looks like I need to come up 1, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Indeed I don't, so there we go. Then bring that back down, and again I'm going down 5, out 2, back along to the central axis, make sure I go along 5, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, back into, up, over 5, down 2, 1, 2, and 3, and along 5, back up, 2, down. I'm going to create the last point not quite at the start point so that we don't end up closing this curve enter to accept that. I'm then going to jump in and grab the very last CV that we've created, and instead of that being -2, I want to bump that over 1 in X, or rather over 0.5 in X, so I'm going to change that to a -1.5. Now I do want to grab the entirety of that curve, wire that into a transform SOP, and I need to translate in Z in a negative direction. It looks like 1.5, so -1.5. That will offset us to actually be centered up on the origin. Fantastic. So I'm going to take that curve in its transform. I'm going to merge that together with our circle. So let's create a merge SOP and wire our circle in. I can then take that, wire it into our control, and bring our visibility down to the control. So we now have our master control. So I can turn off our grid, jump into a front view with space 3, because I want to now position this down in Y underneath our feet. I will turn off grid snap while we're there. So I'm going to position this underneath our feet. Fantastic. Jump into a perspective view, and we can see now that we do have our master control. Now our master control is going to allow for positioning, it's going to allow for rotations, and it's going to allow for scales, but only for uniform scales. So let's go ahead and clean our transform, since this isn't going to be parented underneath anything. So this is the rest position of that control. Let's go ahead and lock our scales, and I'm going to leave everything else available, so we can translate and rotate, and we can scale as long as it is a uniform scale. So now that we have that in place, we can get our hip control parented underneath the master control. So I can take that hip control, make sure I keep position when parenting, and parent that in underneath the master control. Now that I have that parented under the master control, I can clean the hip controls transforms. I also want to make sure that the foot controls are parented in under the master control, so I'm going to grab L_foot control and R_foot control, making sure both of those have keep position when parenting. Take those and parent them in under the master control. We can then go ahead and clean their transforms, because they are now in their rest position. So we now would have, if we move our master control, the entire leg rig in place. We can move our master control, we can rotate our master control, taking the entire leg rig with us. We can also come in and grab our uniform scale, and notice we can scale our leg rig due to the way that we designed the leg rig back in character rigging 1. So we've got our master control in place and working for the legs. We're going to parent in some of the components of our arms, but not all of them. We're going to have the bulk of the arms set up to follow our master control, but there are a couple of parts of the arm rig that actually need to be hooked into the spine when we create the spine at a later date. So I'm going to begin by parenting in our position at shoulder 2 objects that are going to position our arms at the shoulder location. I do need to alter their origin expressions, so then relative to the master control rather than relative to the world. So let's hunt down L_position at shoulder. Notice we don't need keep position when parenting checked, because we're going to adapt the origin expression, parent that into our master control. That will obviously jump down, but we can now come in, and whereas before it was relative to the world with an empty string, we're now going to reference it relative to the master control. I'm going to double click and copy with Control C that expression, Control V to paste for translate Y, paste in for translate Z, also changing the component to TZ for translate Z. So that's the left position at shoulder control in place. I do want to go ahead and get the right position at shoulder control in place. So let's go ahead, hunt down for our right arm, the R_position at shoulder, and let's parent that into our master control as well. That's going to jump down, so we now need to change this relative to the master control rather than relative to the world. So let's jump in here for translate Y, relative to the master control, and I might as well just jump in here for Z as well and make that, if we jump in, relative to the master control. Fantastic. So that will position that also relative to the master control, and that means now that our arms are going to inherit the orientation of our master control, which is fantastic. It also means that if we were to translate our master control currently, they're not going to follow along, and that's because they are referencing a part of the rig that isn't currently hooked up to follow our master control. Also want to get our IK handles connected to the master control. To do that, I'm going to take the IK handle's initial position, the node that exists outside of that super wrist control asset. I'm going to take the IK handle initial position, which is our 2 ARM IK handle node that we created. I want to make sure that we parent that in to the master control keeping position. So let's hunt down the one on the right hand side as well. So our ARM IK handle, and let's parent that in to our master control. So we can keep those parented in since they are acting as that rest position for the IK handle, that initial position for the IK handle. We can get that parented in, and that will mean that now our IK handles will follow along with the master control if we move our master control. We also have, and finally have, our 2 wrist control master control parent. If you recall, our wrist can be oriented in master control space. We want to make sure that in that case we are indeed in master control space, so we need to parent both our 2 wrist control master control parent for left and right into the master control, adapting their origin expressions when we do. So I'm going to parent in our left one into the master control, making sure we're relative to the master control. Copy that, paste that in for translate Y and for translate Z, and do the same on the right hand side as well. So let's go ahead and hunt down our right hand side one. So our 2 wrist control master control parent, parent that in to our master control, make that relative to our master control. I'll do that for Y and also for Z. And with that, that is going to conclude the setup of our master control and our hip control. Again, we still have parts of the arm rig that aren't parented in, things like the clavicle shoulder control, etc. They're going to be attached into our spine setup when we create our spine setup later. But for now, that's everything that could possibly be attached into our master control and hip control. And that will conclude this video. Thanks a lot.